Welcome everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are talking about how Nintendo's next generation console, the successor to the Nintendo Switch, what we've been calling the Nintendo Switch 2, can't fail. Recently, analysts have been talking about how the Switch 2 is likely not going to be as successful as the Switch, and while there may be something to that, something that we've been reminded of is that going into the Switch era, before the Switch had come out, analysts were saying that that console would not do well, some even predicting that it would only sell about 20 million, which to me seems like an asinine prediction. But the overall basic point I want to go over today is how Nintendo Switch 2 can't fail. It's basically impossible in my opinion. How so exactly? Well, that's what we're going to get into today. But before going forward, let me point out that we are aiming to reach 50,000 subscribers, perhaps by the time Switch 2 does come out. So if you do enjoy my content, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Leaving a like is super helpful, and enjoy the ride as we talk about Nintendo every day. So before getting into how Switch 2 can't fail, let's talk about Switch 1, because I think it's really important here. There were analysts suggesting that Switch would not do well, just maybe a little bit better than Wii U, around GameCube levels of success. And the fact of the matter is, that was so far from the truth. As of September 30th, 2023, the Nintendo Switch has sold 132.46 million units worldwide, and that's just in terms of hardware. When we get into software, it's even more staggeringly successful. It's well over a billion, and what's insane about that is that the amount of software Switch has sold has already about doubled the amount of software sold in the prior generation between two different systems. And I think it's also worth noting that now we have prevalent DLC, there is a paid subscription model, and a lot of games are more expensive than they were back in the day, especially compared to 3DS titles. Also, Nintendo has yet to do a single price drop officially across the board for the Nintendo Switch. So the point is, Switch is massively successful, and soon we're going to get numbers on the holiday sales, and I'm sure there's going to be a significant boost in those reported numbers. But let's go back to this idea of analysts predicting that Switch was going to be about as successful as a Nintendo GameCube. It's just an asinine prediction. Now, some of those predictions may have come before they even knew what the Switch was, that they knew it was a hybrid system, which still sort of highlights how asinine it may have been, because if you don't know what a system's going to be, why bother predicting its success level? And I see how some people might find that point I just made to be hypocritical, but I will address that. But anyways, point is, with the 3DS having sold nearly 76 million units, and the Wii U selling 13.5 million units, combined that's approaching about 90 million systems sold. Now, obviously, there's some overlap there. I'm willing to bet that most Wii U owners probably also had a 3DS. But let's say you shave down the number of total Nintendo fans, let's just say to 50, right? Like, even though that's obviously way less than the amount of 3DSs that were out there, but let's just say 50. Do we really think that then only 20 million are going to buy the single Nintendo system for a generation? No, that was never going to happen. And so I think some people fail to realize or fail to consider that for generations, while there may have been one platform that has underperformed, there was always another platform that Nintendo had that was massively successful. During the GameCube era, we had the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS. During the N64 era, we had the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. These were massively successful handheld systems. And so Nintendo's always been dominant in the handheld market. There's always been a large Nintendo fan base, just not always for the home console offerings. So the ultimate point I'm making here is that there's always been a pretty large active Nintendo fan base per generation. And so when people look at the GameCube, the N64, or the Wii U and see that they're only selling somewhere between 15 to 30-ish million, they think, oh, that's the entire Nintendo fan base, and that's just incredibly short-sighted. So with that in mind, going into Switch 2, I do agree that it's going to be challenging for Nintendo Switch 2 to surpass Switch 1. Historically speaking, whenever Nintendo follows up an incredibly successful record-breaking console, well, they have a drop-off. That's not just for Nintendo, that's across the industry, really. So yes, it's going to be hard for Nintendo to surpass the Switch's success with the Switch 2, at least in terms of raw numbers. But this idea that Switch 2 could fail, where it could have numbers that are similar to Wii U, GameCube, or even N64, that's not even a remotely reasonable expectation. The Nintendo audience is just too large, so even if Nintendo drops the ball this gen, because they are now focused on one singular platform, because they've unified their gaming divisions, their audience is going to be focused on whatever it is that they release. And so that system is where the Nintendo audience is going to migrate over to. And the Nintendo audience is not small. If the Switch 2 only sells 80 million systems for the next generation, I would consider that to be a quote-unquote failure. But 80 million, as bad as that would be compared to how well Nintendo's doing now, is still significantly more successful than any of these prior failures Nintendo has had. But it goes beyond just the Nintendo audience focusing on one place. It also has to do with how Nintendo operates now. Because it's just one system now, because Nintendo's gaming divisions are unified now, because they've really worked on their game development ecosystem, we are seeing consistent releases for Nintendo. And this has happened throughout the entire, very lengthy lifespan of the Nintendo Switch. Before Nintendo Switch, Nintendo was spreading themselves thin, trying to put out solid content for two different platforms, a handheld system and a home console system. And even when you take that into account, there were still significant droughts, long periods of time where we didn't have quality games for Nintendo to play. And so Nintendo wasn't always in the mind space of gamers. Fans felt like they didn't have much to play when they owned the Nintendo console a lot of the time. And so, reasonably so, they might migrate elsewhere. So word of mouth wasn't as strong, income wasn't as consistent, and fans weren't satisfied with the Nintendo offerings. But it's not like that now. Nintendo has consistent content coming out all the time. They are always in the mind space of gamers, always being talked about, that word of mouth. It's basically free marketing for Nintendo. And when you have a Switch, you don't need another console. I'm not saying you wouldn't want another console. I'm sure there are many watching that may have multiple consoles, but the majority of Switch users still play on Switch. And there's plenty of games to play, more than enough to keep you interested year-round, every year. So while we don't know exactly what Switch 2 is going to be, this is me addressing the potential hypocrisy with the point I made earlier, we do have a pretty good understanding that Nintendo's going to follow up with something similar, because historically speaking, this is what Nintendo has always done, but also based off everything we've heard from rumors and reports, all signs point to an iterative system. So while there may be some interesting differences that we have not foreseen, it being a hybrid console, that's the expectation. And so with that expectation in mind, as long as Nintendo goes in this direction, they're not going to see a stark drop-off where they have GameCube levels of success, or dare I say even Wii U levels of success. But let's now pivot this conversation into discussing if Switch 2 can surpass Switch 1. It's going to be a tall task. As I brought up earlier, history suggests that whenever there's a great success, there is going to be a drop-off. And assuming Switch 2 is indeed an iterative system, as we expect, then Nintendo might find some challenges in compelling people to buy another Switch when they already have one. If the Switch 2 is just a better, bigger version of Switch 1, then not everyone's going to move on over. And so if Switch 2 can't stand on its own, while also bringing in the old audience, chances are it's not going to beat the Switch 1. But I do see a scenario where it can happen, and it might not be as unlikely as you think. So one of the exciting things to me about the entire Nintendo Switch era is that this has felt like something that Nintendo can continue. The Switch's success is nothing like the Wii, in my opinion, or even the DS, and those were very successful consoles. But those consoles were the lightning in a bottle situation. They provided an interesting gimmick that really brought in a lot of people, excited a whole new type of gamer, but there was no way Nintendo was going to retain that gamer for long. They were fads. That audience moved on to just playing smartphone games, and I don't really see that changing. But I also don't see Nintendo really trying to reclaim that exact audience again. The way Nintendo has handled the Switch era, I think, is the most ideal way to handle things. They did have your Switch Sports, your Ring Fit Adventures, and those games have sold well on Switch. Those games that appeal to a different kind of audience. Because of how great the design of the Switch is, they were allowed to do these different things. The whole Labo situation, that was possible because of how crazy impressive the Joy-Cons are. Yes, Joy-Cons have the issue of drift, but there are just so many different things that the Joy-Cons can do that they're extremely flexible in what kind of games they can support. And so as long as Nintendo continues this model, they can have another system that has controllers that separate, that function as traditional core controllers, where you can play most of your traditional core games. That is the majority of Nintendo's success nowadays. But also you have these motion controllers with little gimmicks packed in that allow for other types of experiences as well, without taking away from the core experience, which is why we've seen things like Nintendo Labo, Ring Fit Adventure, and Switch Sports. All fun experiences that are performed well, but they didn't get away of your Breath of the Wilds, your Mario Odysseys, your Super Smash Bros. Ultimates, your Animal Crossing New Horizons. Nintendo was able to do everything, in part because of the form factor of the system, but also because, again, their development ecosystem now is so streamlined, they have so much more going for them, they don't have droughts anymore, they have the resources to put together a variety of different types of games and not have droughts. And then they also have partners that they can rely on that can output pretty good things too, like Metroid Dread, for example. That was made by Mercury Steam. Outside of Nintendo oversaw the project, but it was one of the best games of 2021, and we've seen a variety of projects like that throughout the Switch era. And I expect more are on the way, especially after the words from Chris String, how he heard that Nintendo speaking with other developers on projects they could be working on. So maybe we see other forgotten Nintendo franchises see a resurgence during the Switch 2 era. But the ultimate point I'm trying to make here is that what they accomplished with Switch 1, I think is mostly something they can replicate on Switch 2. The Ring Fit Adventures, the Switch Sports, the Nintendo Labos, people didn't buy a Switch for those experiences for the most part. People picked up those experiences once they already had a Switch. And so Switch 2 can do something similar. The real reason people are buying Switch is for the games. And as long as Nintendo continues to bring the games, they're going to be fine. There's rumors of 3D Mario being the launch title, which makes a lot of sense. It's probably what's going to happen, or at least it's going to be coming out early on for the system. And this game is probably going to blow our minds. Everyone's going to want it. And if it's an exclusive for Switch 2, how do you get to play the 3D Mario game? By buying the Switch 2. So as long as Nintendo puts out the games, they're going to see strong success. But something else I'll also throw out there is that Nintendo is branching out. We have the Universal Parks, they've continually done more and more merchandising, amiibos are consistently coming out. We have the Nintendo movies, the Mario movie was the second most successful animated movie of all time in theaters. That's crazy to think about. And they've recently announced a Legend of Zelda live action movie, and Zelda's the most popular it's ever been. So Nintendo is in a position to really branch out here and expand their popularity. They've already been doing the mobile games, and we've seen how that's boosted a lot of their popularity as well. And so all these things are going to continue. Nintendo is expanding their brand. More and more people are becoming more and more welcoming and acclimated to Nintendo. And so, while it is going to be an uphill battle for Switch 2 to beat Switch 1, because Nintendo as an overall brand is growing, and because Nintendo is likely, very likely, continuing this unified direction of focusing on one platform where it's a hybrid, that Nintendo audience is going to follow, and the formula that they did on Switch 1 is something that they can continue to do. It's not a fad. It's not a lightning in a bottle situation like in the past. This is something that will likely continue. Not too different from how Sony does things. Sony pretty consistently has successful systems. Yes, they vary, but they just pretty much do a very similar thing. PS1, PS2, PS3, PS4, PS5, and that PlayStation audience continues. And so Nintendo's audience will continue, but also the Nintendo audience seems to be growing. And so we'll see what happens. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care.